Hi everybody, good morning. Back in my old heartland, I started in advertising. My early career was, I joined Footcone and Belding in Sydney, and for my sins took up a post with McCann Erickson. Went to New York, started working in the international division. And around about that time, for those of you who are historians, because it's so long ago you probably have to go to a library and look it up, that was the time of the big kind of agency amalgamations. And agencies at that stage started to think, gosh, growth is kind of hard to find. Where is this going to come from now? So they started in the diversification stakes. I was a planner, early stages of what, it wasn't called globalization then, it was called internationalization. It was when big companies started to see efficiency in developing global strategy, global campaigns, and running it out all over the place. And I was working in New York in the international division of McCann's, a guy called Peter Hamilton. We were working with Coke. And we had some fun kind of looking at the challenges of executing strategy simultaneously in multiple cultures, in multiple countries. And that started to form a point of view about, where does this work well and where doesn't it? And of course, the obvious thing to look at, not necessarily from my professional occupation, I'd studied international business and I was a marketing guy, I was a planner. But I became very interested in organizational cultures and national cultures. So culture and the context in which things happen started to really form a point of view in my approach to getting things done. As we double-clicked that a little bit further, though, it became really obvious, like, yeah, culture matters. But there's something more than that. What we found is that the thing that made the biggest difference in whether a piece of strategy was effectively executed and a growth plan actually delivered growth or it didn't, had actually less to do with the physical contours of an organizational culture or the challenges and of a geography. And it had much more to do with the actual mindset of the leaders. And this developed something which then became a total pivot for me, away from strategy and its execution to actually the study of leadership. And what is it that leaders do that make things happen? Because that actually was what made the difference. Round about that time, I was headhunted by DDB and started a part of their business called, it was then DDB Needham, by the way, and started the Needham Consulting Group. And their kind of fuzzy logic, I don't think it ever worked actually, was that if we as an agency are providing consultancy for high-level strategy decisions, that'll influence where the advertising account gets set. I don't think that ever worked once. But nonetheless, what we did succeed to do is started to really develop an effective approach in understanding how do you create the context for change. And that led to what is now the Oxford Leadership Organization. We've got about 250 people. And we work primarily for large companies at a stage in their evolution or their growth that you could say if they were ships, they've capsized. And our job, our role at a pretty critical time is how do you right the ship? So my interest, and particularly in my early studies in leadership, was observing what is it that leaders do at critical moments in making really good choices and decisions that right the ship, that get things happening. And I distinguish that a little bit differently because that's the context in which I want to share some ideas with you now about what is it that happens. And yes, you could expect me, I run a leadership company, so you're expecting me to give you some messages, insights into what does good leadership look like. But context is important with this, and the context that we use in our own kind of imaging, our own branding, is what's behind me here. Let me just ask you a question first. Who woke up this morning, leapt out of bed and said, I really want to become less today? Really? No one? Gosh, how surprising. You know what? None of your people did either. And none of the people who work for the clients that you work for did either. Not a single person ever gets out of bed and says, I want to become less. For Christ's sake, everybody wants to grow. Everybody wants to become more. And yet, particularly when times are tough, particularly when there's challenge, the experience when they get into the agency, they get into the office, they arrive at work, or they arrive at the factory, or they arrive, is that they become minimized. They become less. They become humiliated. They are surrounded by the conditions which actually, neurologically, and sometimes even physically, just shrinks them down. What do you think is going to happen? And that's why, and then you hear kind of all of the memes of leadership. Well, we got to make things happen here. We got to, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. Yeah, shit, okay. Duh, yeah. Omelets and people are very different things. Honestly, if you break an egg from the outside, what do you think happens? Life stops. However, if an egg breaks from the inside, life begins. Something's happening from the inside. And that's what great leaders do. If I was to put my finger on one thing that leaders do differently, they create the context, they create the conditions for people to grow. So as we go in, and yes, I'll give you a little bit more, perhaps more cerebral, a little bit of scientific insight into what do you do to create the conditions for growth. But the first and the single most important thing, remember, forget everything else, but just take this away. Context really matters. There are two things in your life, and certainly in your business, certainly in your leadership, that you need to master. Context and choices. At the end of the day, it'll be the choices that you make. That's what will determine where your marriage will end up. That's what will determine where your business will end up, where your industry will end up. That's what will determine how your health ends up when you're around my age. The choices that you've made for years ahead of that around wellness and diet and exercise, etc. So choices, by choices I mean big choices, and I do distinguish. This is simply a Brian Bacon thing. I do distinguish between choices and decisions. Decisions are what you make to execute a choice. You might, for instance, let's make it simple. You might choose to live a healthy lifestyle. That's a choice. Am I going to eat that donut? That's a decision. Am I going to go to the gym today? That's a decision. So that's what I distinguish. But it is the big choices that you make. And some of the biggest and the most important choices that you will make are actually not those which you think they are. Yes, of course, who am I going to marry? Where am I going to work? What are we going to invest in? What are we going to withdraw investing from? Of course they are. They are the big and strategic decisions. But what will have the biggest impact on the trajectory of your life and on your business is the choices that you make inadvertently. You don't even think they're choices. You think, well, that's just kind of, that's just a flow. But actually, if you are present enough, get off the dance floor, stand on the balcony, you will actually recognize you are making a choice in the way that you behave. Now, what raises the odds of you making more good choices and bad choices in your business, in your agency, in your life, is your ability to understand context. Context matters. When I was back in advertising, one of the award-winning ads in the world at the time came out of Britain. I can't remember the agency. I don't think it was BBH. Maybe it was. Someone will correct me if I get it wrong anyway. It was for the Guardian newspaper. And some of you might remember it. It was this guy of the stereotypical English businessman, kind of FT under his arm, walking out along the street, comes out of a building, bit of scaffolding around the front of the building. If you looked at the ad a second time, you'd recognize, yeah, it's probably a bank. So he's walking along the street, camera pulls back, and a tough guy is coming up the street behind him. You know, t-shirt, bald head, tattoos, piercings and so forth, sees this guy and starts running towards him. And the camera pulls back just a little bit more. And do you know the ad I'm talking about? It's okay, all right. And so the voiceover continues and it says, when you see a situation from one position, you see part of what's going on. And then the camera the camera pulls back a little bit more and the guy grabs the businessman, pulls him to the ground. You think, holy crap, this is going to get, this is nasty. This is a mugging. And then camera pulls back a little bit further and you see there's scaffolding being around the building and some building materials just crashed down. This guy grabs him, pulls him out of the ground, saves his life in the flash of an instant. And the voiceover continues. But it's only when you see the whole picture do you really understand what's going on. Read the Guardian newspaper, get the whole picture. Don't know if I actually went out and bought the Guardian. I don't know what it did to their sales, but it actually, that laid inside me one of the most important truths about life and certainly about leadership. Context is everything. And in order, in the world that we're in at the moment, to understand anything like the degree of complexity that exists in a situation for a client in your life, you are going to make really crappy decisions if you make them alone. And the ability to harness the collective intelligence of the group of people in your tribe, in your guild if you like, but in your proximity is the critically most important subject in leadership. The harnessing of collective intelligence is the only way you will ever overcome your own cognitive bias. And leaders forget this. That's why, amongst other reasons, the great man theory of leadership is dead. It's over, it's finished. Because the great man will always make really shitty decisions. Some will be good, but most will be bad. The only way that you will make collectively strong decisions is if you can create the context in which you can harness the multiple perspectives of the 12 blind people, metaphorically, that comprise your organization, tap them and get that, aha, this is where we need to go. And that is why growth. That's why creating the conditions for growth, creating the conditions for harnessing the collective intelligence is so powerful. Not only is this a fairly obvious thing to come to, and it was an observation that I made several years ago, several decades ago, but it was validated relatively recently when we started in Oxford Leadership, pretty significant piece of research looking at the impact of disruptive technologies in the big companies that we work for. Big companies like Maersk, the world's biggest shipping company. You know, one of their biggest competitors now, certainly fastest growing, if not biggest, but certainly the fastest growing competitor doesn't have any ships. Doesn't have any steel, doesn't have any ports, doesn't have any containers. It's a bunch of guys out of Silicon Valley that have got container.com and are doing an Uber, moving containers, tens of thousands of the buggers all over the world. And how does a big company, 100 years old, dominant in the shipping industry, manage to do two things simultaneously? Continue to perform in an environment in which it is tough to meet quarterly earnings, and at the same time transform your organization to meet new Ubers or Airbnbs, people that are coming on and disrupting the bejesus out of you. How do you do those two things simultaneously? It's difficult. Every big company that we're working with, some of them are up there in front of you, we're facing those kinds of challenges. Every single one of your client companies, every one of your own organizations, indeed your own organization, will be facing this challenge. It's not just this or that any longer. It's not just perform, and then if you need to, take the ship out of the water, put it in the dry docks, rebuild it, and send it back to sea. You've got to rebuild the ship while it's still at sea. You have to learn how to perform and transform. Our interest in this was not actually the technologies which are transforming organizations, but it's actually how do you lead a transformation? How do you create the conditions in which the people of an organization, which are already resource-pressed, there's already been stacks of efficiency programs, so you've got fewer people doing more things. And have you noticed this about transformation programs? Leaders love to add the few things that make the biggest difference. Everybody's got that script. Let's focus on the few things that make the biggest difference. Okay, we've got the 4 giants. Now let's add everything under these 4 things. Super. What are you giving up? Well, I mean, that's another thing altogether. No one gives anything up. You just continue to do all the other stuff. Business as usual continues with hardly any giving up. And you add more layers of priorities on top of that. That's the most common phenomena that we see. That was one of the biggest challenges that these companies faced. And so what we sought to do was to understand what can we learn from these companies about how leadership gets defined in a, let's call it a 4th industrial revolution environment. That was popular language a couple of years ago. I think it's still fairly relevant. A few things we found significant. Look on our website if you like. I don't have the time and I don't think it's the context to give you the algorithm. But there are 6 things that we found that make the biggest difference. It's like in the DNA, in the same, your DNA, my DNA is 96% the same as our closest relative, the chimpanzee. 96% is pretty much the same. That 4% makes us pretty bloody different though. I mean, the difference between you and me, between each of us, not only male and female, but each of us is relatively small, 0.001%. But fundamentally we're the same. But that small percentage of difference makes a big, big difference. We isolated 6 things that make really the biggest difference. Not going to run through them all, but just one. One, it's purpose. The companies that have really nailed this have found a way of creating a context in which the inside-out purpose and meaning, the thing that I absolutely am passionate about, I love to do, I feel like I'm growing, I feel like I'm fulfilled, I feel like I'm really becoming more, when that connects to the purpose of the business, and that in turn connects to a purpose beyond the business, into the world that I'm living in, or I'm really feeling I'm influencing change in the world, and I'm doing something that matters, that's power. And if you can find that acts like a kebab stick that holds everything. You know what a kebab is, right? You can put all sorts of stuff on a kebab. You can put shrimp and meat and vegetables and all kinds of stuff. Your life's like a kebab. You've got your gym stuff, you've got your health stuff, you've got your work stuff, you've got this committee, you've got that P&L responsibility, you've got this. There's a lot of stuff going on. Whatever holds all of this together? For mostly, nothing does. It's just a frigging mess. But for those people that have found what it is, a common purpose that shreds all of that together, that is real power. That's the kebabs. So here's your lesson in leadership. Find your kebab stick. After that, everything else works. The kebab stick largely is about defining what is the one thing that threads through all of the complexity of a Virgin Media or a L'Oreal or an HSBC. And there are 2 things together. And we talk about this as the North Star. So a North Star is a metric that expresses a purpose, like a kebab stick that flows through the whole organization that everyone connects to. Largely speaking, this is fairly logically and obviously the North Star for most organizations that are seeking growth. It's customer satisfaction or it's customer engagement or some dimension of that. But what we learned from these companies that have truly succeeded in transforming their organization, they found a duality around this. And we refer to it as the single most powerful metric that we are seeing showing up in organizations today is customer and employee advocacy. I'm not going to spend any time on customer advocacy. That goes without saying. You know enough about that. By advocacy, I mean this is how you measure with usually Net Promoter Score. Advocacy is, would a customer recommend you to somebody else? Not only that, a deeper measure is, has a customer recommended you? What would you have to do in the organization to make that happen? That within itself is powerful enough, but it can only be fulfilled if you combine that yin and yang with employee advocacy, creating the conditions when an employee says, wow, this is such a frigging great place to work. I would absolutely recommend my best friend to come and work here. Now, if you can start measuring your organization, creating the conditions where choices start getting made around that metric, you've got power. Companies that we've seen do that, 40% more likely to be competitive, 57% more likely to get increased sales and leads, 58% more likely to attract top talent. Duh, of course it does. And you can see the impact of that. I'll share these slides with you later. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it around profitability, productivity, customer satisfaction, quality. Knocks it right out of the park. What am I talking about here? Create the conditions where people grow inside. Give you a little example here. A few years ago, I started working with McDonald's. It was in the early 2000s. The guy who was running actually McDonald's here in Europe, his name is Charlie Bell. He was a young Australian, and it was somewhat coincidental that I happened to come from that part of the world as well. He had had a fairly meteoric rise through McDonald's. He started working in their airport store at Kingsford Smith Airport when he was 15, flipping hamburgers. literally flipping hamburgers. Part-time job, then became a full-time job. Rose up through the ranks in Australia, became managing director of the Australian operations, became head of the region in Asia. And then when things started to go for McDonald's a little bit south, he was, because of his performance capabilities, he was moved to Europe. He was head of McDonald's in Europe. Now at this stage, something was happening with McDonald's. Here was a company that since 1954 had never, ever, ever known a loss. They'd never had a loss quarter, ever. So there wasn't a single executive anywhere in the company that had experienced anything like a retraction. Little sideways here. My wife, she's Japanese, Swedish. She deals with people that have life-threatening illnesses. She deals with people that have got cancer. She tells me something about how you die from cancer. Very, very slowly. Very, very gradually. And then very, very suddenly. And I thought, that's fairly interesting. I mean, it's a completely different context, but I've observed that over 30 years as well. Big companies, whether they be the Nokias or anything else, they also die like that. Very, very slowly. Very, very gradually. Then very, very suddenly. If you can pick the cancer, if you can nail it, if you can get your immune system firing again, that'll take on those cancer cells at the very slowly, very gradually stage, you'll live again. You'll continue to live. However, if it gets to the very suddenly stage, you're pretty screwed. Same with companies. The smartest thing that you can do is to create an immune system that starts to recognize when things are going wrong before they do. McDonald's saw their share price topple from $38 to $11.50 in 3 quarters. They had a loss, then they had another, then they had another. They were going down. This company was in crisis. 1.6 million employees. A company that owns more real estate than any other institution on earth except the Catholic Church. Actually, McDonald's don't own that much less real estate than the Catholic Church. This is a huge company. It was going down. And so the CEO was fired. Jack Greenberg taken out. They brought a new guy in that had led the international expansion. His name was Jim Cantalupo. He died on the job 6 months after he started. The company was in serious crisis. They wondered whether or not Charlie Bell could be a candidate because he'd been kicking goals in his career all throughout. He was now running Europe. The guy who was incredibly influential around McDonald's, actually that wasn't the slide I mean this guy. No, I don't mean him, I mean this guy. Warren Buffett was on the nominations committee at the time when the company was in crisis. By this stage I was working with Charlie here in London, running the European region. Warren Buffett was not terribly keen on Charlie because for a few reasons. Number one, too young. Just turned 40. Number two, not American. Not that that mattered to him per se, but he had never had a history working in a complex, incredibly complex environment like the US. Just far too risky. But others on all of the metrics were guiding him, look at Charlie, this guy probably has what it takes to know what's going on. And it was actually in a restaurant like this, in a McDonald's restaurant, that I sat, and when Warren Buffett met Charlie Bell, it was a very interesting conversation. First question, so Charlie, what are you going to do about our image problem if you would become CEO? The guy looked at him and he said, well, with respect, Warren, I don't think we've got an image problem. And he sat back and he said, excuse me? He said, you don't think we've got an image problem? Like, what about child obesity? What about Brazilian rainforest depletion? You don't think we've got an image problem? He said, no, sir. What I think we have is a big fat reality problem, not an image problem. And with respect, it's people like you who believe that we can solve the problems that we've got in our system by bloody good advertising simply are the problem. We need to address the realities of what's really going wrong. That was an interesting answer. He said, okay, next question. You've never run a big battleship like this before. How would you turn this battleship around? And he said, well, once again, I hate to contradict you 2 times in the same conversation, but McDonald's is not a battleship, mate. McDonald's is 23,000 speedboats. He said, I know bugger all about battleships, but I know a hell of a lot about what goes on in those speedboats. And at the moment, they are pretty screwed and they're pretty unhappy. Tell you one little story and then I'll get out of your way. That led to this. This is the biggest, most sustained turnaround, the fastest turnaround of any company in Dow Jones in history. They adopted a principle of iconic moves. They had 6 iconic moves. You know what an icon is, right? So an iconic move is a strategy, it's an impact that has a meaning way beyond what it means. It has a big meaning, it sends a signal out to a system. Putting salads on the core menu lineup was an iconic move. They never expected to become the company in the world that would be best known for salads. Bullshit. That was sending a signal. We heard you, we get it. Here's an option. We are genuinely going to make a difference. And the other was they targeted iconic moves at the critical acupuncture points that you need to sort. And one of them was on, to make this quick, crew turnover. You know what crew turnover is, right? So 1.6 million people at that stage, there's more now, worked at McDonald's. Their turnover in the restaurants, their total turnover was 76%. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine what it costs to hire, train, onboard, etc.? Now, take this into account. A lot of people get their first jobs at McDonald's. A lot of people, so the turnover is naturally fairly high, but 76%, that's off the charts. So what they did, they put together, tapping collective intelligence, and identified the best people from across the system that are truly vested, that could be like the 12 people describing an elephant that could come up with the best ideas around this. And I was in Oak Brook in Chicago. We were actually going off to to a video conference room. The door was open on one of the conference halls. Charlie looked in and he saw a bunch of people that he recognized. And he said, what's going on here? And he said, this is a plan to win meeting, Charlie, which is the name of their transformation program. And he said, great, what's the focus? Crew turnover. He said, absolutely, must win battle. So what's the target? What's the objective? And it was 76% crew turnover. Objective, bring it round. They wanted to drop it down. They needed to get it down below 40%. A massive shift globally for a metric like that. And he said, absolutely cool. Now, the way in which we cast a transformation program is ask the right question. Make sure you are focused on answering the right question. Get the right people in the room to answer that question. So he said, so what's the question? And the question that had just started, the question that they were working with was, how do we get people to stay? He said, you know what? For me, that's exactly the right problem. But for me, that's completely the wrong question. If you want to cast the right question and find the right solution, you've got to work with the true purpose of what we are. What is our purpose here? And they'd all known that. They'd heard him talk before. Our purpose is to become the solution, become part of the solution in everything that we do. And he said, look, and you've also got to work with your strengths. And the strengths are, look at McDonald's. We've got 1.6 million, more people get their first job at McDonald's than any other place in the United States. They train more young people than any other institution, second only to the US Army. The impact that McDonald's have in every society and community they have is massive. And he said, I would suggest a different question for you. What if we established a policy that says anyone who leaves McDonald's should leave as a better person than when they came? And everything that we do should be guided by that question. And that changes everything that you do. So you create the environment where people can get a job, they can get a career track, they can learn to manage their money, they can learn life skills. And he said to them, what if we did that? What if we created in these speedboats that kind of environment? And someone said, I think more people would stay. He said, so do I. 2 years later, global crew turnover of McDonald's was 34%. 2 years. You create the context for people to grow, they will grow. I'll leave you with one final little story. Which touches the most important, because I was supposed to talk about this, and Mark referred to it earlier about growth mindset. get the book, read the book. It is about having a growth mindset. It is about understanding the difference between seeing failure as an opportunity to grow versus failure to limit your possibilities. It is a mindset of leadership more than anything else. The thing is about growth mindset that people forget that it's not just about your mind, it's primarily about your heart. I was a speaker at a conference quite a while ago, so this will really date me. Not that I'm an old guy anyhow. It was a conference in Geneva, and it coincided with the United Nations. I think it was their 50th anniversary, and it was a big, big leadership conference. So you had all the big names there, all of the authors. You had Peter Senge, if you know who he is, Tom Peters, you remember him? All these Peters were there. Margaret Wheatley, a number of these others, big guys. It was like the who's who of leadership and change and transformation. I was there as a speaker. I was there in the who's he category, not the who's who. What they did, the organisers of this, did a little evaluation at the end of it as to whose message would have the biggest impact on changing the way they do things. And all the speakers were pretty good, so they all got very high evaluations, except one speaker. It was a woman. And her evaluation was literally off the charts. Because people, I can't remember now, but if it was scored 1 to 10, people were writing 15 and ticking that. And it was somebody that wasn't even on the original official speakers lineup. It was Mother Teresa. So you think, hang on a second, what's Mother Teresa doing at a business conference? And the reason was that at exactly the same time, United Nations having their 50th anniversary, she was a speaker there. The organisers of this business conference convinced her to come over and give a closing message. And I'll leave you with her closing message. They actually had to put a little box up on the podium because she was so short. And she looked at people just for a moment in silence. She said, I really don't know what I'm doing here. She said, I don't know anything about business. I don't know anything about leadership. But I think I might know a little bit about change. And I should have told you this. The title of this conference was The Architecture and Engineering of Change. Which I thought, are you kidding me? I mean, that's how you think change happens? Like building a bridge or putting up a building? Anyhow, coming back to Mother Teresa, she said, I think I know a little bit about change. She said, let me ask you a question. Do you know your people? Do you love them? Because if you don't know your people, there'll be no understanding. And if there's no understanding, no one will take any risks. Do you love your people? Because if there's no love in what you do, there'll be no power in your people. And if there's no power, nothing will change. So she said, I don't know anything about business, but I do know this. If you want to change your people, you have to really know your people and you have to love them. That to me was perhaps one of the most important messages that I've heard. And if you want to know about how to find growth, it is not just a matter of mindset, it's a matter of heart set. That people will forget what you said, people forget what you did, but people are never going to forget how you made them feel. And how you will make them feel more, is create the conditions in which they will grow. I'll leave you with that message. Congratulations in advance. Growing yourself, growing your people. Thanks a lot. Have fun.